Chapter 1. The Garden Party at Rosehill. The village of Rosehill, though no more than a scattering of stone cottages, a modest high street, and a square-towered church with moss on its roof, had always taken pride in doing things properly. Thus, the annual garden party in the grounds of Rosehill Manor was not merely an entertainment. It was an institution. For nearly 40 years, the villagers had gathered beneath the wide chestnut trees, balancing plates of sponge cake and cups of tea, while admiring the roses that bordered the gravelled walk. This year the afternoon had been blessed with weather both warm and fair. The lawns were bright with bunting, children ran shrieking with delight towards the stalls of toffee apples, and the vicar's wife was busily coaxing donations for the raffle. Ladies in flowered dresses clustered around trestle tables, remarking upon the quality of jam or the disappointments of the potato harvest. Gentlemen, retired most of them, compared their dahlias with the sober satisfaction of men who believed flowers to be almost as serious a business as politics. Among the gathering, Miss Jane Marple sat serenely in a wicker chair, just to the left of the bandstand. A teacup rested lightly in her gloved hand. She wore a small straw hat, a pale blue dress with a simple collar, and an expression of benign interest that concealed the sharpest of observations. To the casual onlooker she appeared merely a sweet old lady enjoying the day's sunshine. In truth, her eyes missed very little, the fretful glance of Mrs. Abernathy towards her husband at the refreshment table, the odd silence that fell between two of the Rosehill sisters, the discreet but hurried passing of an envelope from one man to another. Miss Marple never interfered. She merely noted. Human nature, she often reflected, had a curious habit of repeating itself. The smallest gestures in Rosehill might be mirrored in essence in great tragedies elsewhere. It was towards 4 o'clock, when the prizes for the flower arrangements were being announced, that the pleasant hum of the afternoon altered. Mrs. Larch, the housekeeper at Rosehill Manor, came hurrying across the lawn. Her broad face, normally composed and ruddy, bore a look of shock. She whispered something quickly into the ear of Mr. Ewan, the steward. He turned pale, set down his lemonade untasted, and vanished into the house with her. A few moments later, as the brass band gamely struck up a tune, a cry rang out from the direction of the library windows, sharp, abrupt, and chilling. The music faltered. A child began to wail. A hush fell over the gathering. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Weatherby, clutching her string of pearls. "What was that?" Several men, led by the vicar and Dr. Graham, strode towards the manor. There was the sound of running footsteps, of doors opening and closing, of voices raised in alarm. The crowd pressed forward, half anxious, half eager. Gossip, after all, was as natural to village life as the air itself. Miss Marple did not move from her chair. She set down her cup carefully upon its saucer, adjusted her gloves, and waited. She had the calm air of one who knows the shape of what is coming, even before it arrives. Within 10 minutes the vicar reappeared, his face grave. He mounted the bandstand, cleared his throat, and announced in a voice unsteady with emotion, "There has been a most distressing incident. Mr. Harold Pritchard, you all know him well, has been found dead in the library. I must ask everyone to remain calm and to leave the grounds in an orderly fashion." The shock rippled across the lawns. Gasps, exclamations, and whispers broke out at once. Mr. Pritchard, the respectable though not universally liked solicitor of Rosehill, was dead. How? Why? And at a garden party of all places. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief instant. Death was no stranger to her, though it never ceased to grieve. When she opened them again, her gaze travelled slowly over the faces about her. The neighbour who looked frightened, the young man who looked guilty, the widow who looked altogether too composed. Human nature, she thought, always the same, in Rosehill as in St. Mary Mead, and somewhere amid the confusion she was quite sure of it. A truth was already whispering itself, waiting for someone to listen. Chapter 2. Whispers After Tea. The proper thing to do, as everyone knew, was to go home at once and say nothing until one had been asked. That principle held in Rosehill for births, marriages, and the price of butter. Why it should fail in the matter of a death was not immediately apparent to those present. Yet fail it did, as the carriages, for Mrs. Fortescue insisted upon calling any motor car a carriage, rolled away from the manor gates, and bicycles wobbled down the lane beneath the dripping shade of the elms. Conversation broke out with a vigour that might have done credit to a political meeting. "Shot, I dare say," said Mrs. Weatherby, whose confidences were usually prefaced by that neat, devastating phrase, "I dare say. Men who deal with money are always shot, or poisoned," she added, brightening a little at the possibilities. "Dear me, poison," murmured the vicar's wife, who felt that poison belonged to sensational fiction and ought not to exist within 5 miles of a respectable church. "But perhaps a seizure. Mr. Pritchard always looked so. Congested people, my dear," said Mrs. Weatherby with a firmness that closed the subject. "Do not cry out like that." At the gate 2 maidservants from the manor stood together in a tremulous cluster, like sparrows on a hedge. "In the library it was," one repeated for the 3rd time, as if the place of it presented the chief horror. "On the carpet, like he'd tripped over the hearthrug, and then well, mind you don't say a word," said the other, who could more keep counsel than a sieve can hold water. But the injunction pleased her with its air of importance. Miss Marple came away more slowly than most. She had allowed the press at the drive to subside, then slipped almost unseen into a shaded side path that led along the shrubbery skirting the house. There was no impropriety in her doing so. Miss Marple did not do improper things. But a little detour sometimes yielded a little knowledge. She paused by the low library window, French doors really, whose lace curtains stirred very slightly in the warm air. Upon the gravel immediately before the steps there was, to a mind trained to see it, a scatter which did not quite belong. 3 small crumbs of dark sponge, a dab of something sticky and red, jam perhaps, and the faintest smear of boot black where a heel had turned more quickly than it intended. Farther along the border, a spray of lady's mantle had been bruised, so that its fan-shaped leaves were clotted with silver droplets from the dew it carried like pearls. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment upon the plant, and then drifted to the door itself. One of the 2 brass bolts at the top and bottom stood back. The other had been thrust forward again so hastily that a crescent of bright metal showed beyond the dull polish of daily use. Such a crescent appears only when the hand is hurried or unaccustomed. "Dear me," said Miss Marple to the leaves and the bolt alike, as if offering a condolence. She had the look of a woman counting stitches in her knitting. A cough sounded discreetly a little way behind her. Mr. Ewan, the steward, stood with his cap in his hands, grave and flushed. He had the pallor of a conscientious man to whom something irregular has occurred upon his watch. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple. The inspector will be here presently. Best if folks go on home now." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently. "Such a terrible business, Mr. Ewan. I am very sorry for you. The house cannot help being upset." "The house will do what's proper," Mr. Ewan said with a shade too much determination. "Only there'll be questions." "There always are," Miss Marple observed. "If I might just advise a very little thing, do have someone put a plate over that jam. It draws wasps, and wasps, I have noticed, are careless about where they tread." Mr. Ewan looked puzzled, then grateful, without in the least understanding why. "Yes, miss. Much obliged, I'm sure." Miss Marple walked away then, down the lane where the hedge roses nodded faintly, and turned towards the centre of the village. Rosehill's High Street made no great claims. There was Mr. Cholmondeley's grocer and provisions, pronounced despite appearances, Chumley, a post office that smelt agreeably of gum and brown paper, the Green Man public house at the bend, and the little tea shop where, at that hour, one could get a Chelsea bun which tempted even the resolute. The sun had tilted downwards. A lorry droned by with farm sacks in the back. Nothing looked different, and yet everything was. At the post office, Miss Hart, the postmistress, had already heard. That was to be expected. She had a respectful admiration for Miss Marple, and a slight terror of her. Both sentiments, perhaps, were reasonable. Terrible Miss Marple! Terrible Mr. Pritchard of all people! And at the Manor such a business for Lady Fortescue, you can imagine. Inspector Cross is on his way from Marley Combe, they say. A capable man, said Miss Marple, who had never, to her knowledge, set eyes upon Inspector Cross, but considered it wise to offer the world a little encouragement when it could do no harm. Miss Hart's hand hovered over the stamped drawer. They say, she went on in the tone of one constrained by duty yet impelled by nature, that there was a letter found near, but not addressed proper. No name. If a letter has no name, what's to be made of it? I always say a letter should have its proper address, else it's as bad as a person without a parish. A letter without a name, Miss Marple repeated, as one might repeat a line from a hymn. How very curious. Was it, perhaps, in a hand, you know? Miss Hart coloured faintly, as women do when their knowledge is both extensive and indefensible. Oh, now, I should never say such a thing. Only, well, there are hands and there are hands, and Mr. Pritchard's clerk has a fist like a spider drowned in ink. This was neat. Lady's hand, I should think. Foreign paper, too, thin like onion skin, if what I was told is true. But I wasn't told, of course. Not properly. Of course not, said Miss Marple, with a small nod that took in both the sin and the absolution. And stamps? Miss Hart blinked. No stamp at all. That's the curious part. It didn't come through here, not yesterday nor today. So I can say, as postmistress, it was not the post. It must have been put into his hand. By a hand, murmured Miss Marple, that did not sign its name. She purchased a packet of notepaper she did not require, thanked Miss Hart, and went out. In the tea-shop she took a small corner table near the window. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling and a Chelsea bun, which came glazed and fragrant, and sat quietly, the spoon turning in the cup. Two young girls at the next table spoke with a thrill that betrayed their youth. In the library, one whispered, and his spectacles are crooked. That will be the maid talking, said the other. They make things worse. But Mummy says Mr. Pritchard was not liked. He always sent letters. About money. Letters, Miss Marple repeated in the privacy of her mind. The word had a habit of coming back, like a penny rolled down a corridor. She ate her bun in little precise bites, for she disliked stickiness on the fingers, and rose when she had finished. On her way out she nearly collided with Dr. Graham, who came in looking harassed, his good grey hair a little ruffled. He took Miss Marple's hand with real warmth. My dear Miss Marple, you heard, of course. A dreadful business. Yes, said Miss Marple. I am very sorry. Mrs. Graham will be anxious. She is a tower, said the doctor briefly, and I must be off to the Manor again. Inspector will want me for the formalities. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Between ourselves, I should not be surprised if we have to think of it as not natural causes. There is a mark, you see, which I do not like. Poor Mr. Pritchard, murmured Miss Marple. Suffering is never admirable, Doctor, but the causing of it is worse. The doctor's mouth twisted ruefully. You always go to the centre, Miss Marple. Tell me, is there any impression you have? You are famous for impressions. Miss Marple looked at him with an innocence which almost deceived. Only that wasps are very foolish creatures, and boys will put their hands where they ought not, and that men who have been reading letters sometimes put their spectacles down on the wrong page. Dr. Graham blinked, then laughed despite himself. Yes. Well, I must be off. He pressed her hand and was gone. When Miss Marple reached her cottage at the edge of the green, the evening had drawn a thin veil over things, as though to make them gentle. Her small parlour was tidy. There were roses in a jug on the mantel, and a bowl of knitting wool beside the armchair. She took up her duster and set it down again. Dusting is a very good occupation for troubled thoughts, but it can wait upon necessity. Instead, she went to the little writing desk under the window and drew from it a sheet of paper and a bottle of ink. She wrote very carefully 3 names upon the paper: Mr. Harold Pritchard, Mrs. Larch, Mr. Ewan. She paused, then added, "The steward's crescent on the bolt, jam on gravel, crumbs, dark sponge, crushed alchemilla, letter without name, lady's hand, foreign paper, delivered by hand." She held the pen above the next line and considered. Finally she wrote with a faint private smile, "Envelope passed earlier, man to man, beneath chestnut." For Miss Marple had not forgotten that brief, almost invisible transaction near the bandstand, when a tall fair man in a serviceable tweed coat had transferred a thin envelope to the hand of a smaller, darker man whose eyes did not rise to meet his. It had been done with that particular casualness which is, to an experienced eye, the very opposite of natural. A light tapping sounded in the hall, very discreet. It was not the manner of villagers to pound upon Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find Mrs. Larch, the housekeeper of the manor, standing without hat or gloves, her broad face pink and damp as if she had come at speed. "Beggin' pardon, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands with an instinct to wring something. "It's a liberty I know. Only I thought as you'd be the right one to tell. Mr. Ewan, he says, talk to the inspector. But I says, I'll just step around to Miss Marple a moment, it being a woman's matter and delicate. And now I've done it, and I don't know if I ought." "It is often very sensible," said Miss Marple, drawing her into the little parlour, "to do the thing one feels one oughtn't. Sit down, Mrs. Larch. Would a glass of barley water be of use?" Mrs. Larch accepted the barley water as a sinner accepts absolution. "It's this, miss. There's a letter." "Not the one they've found. I mean, they've found one, and that's for the inspector, I know. But there's another. Came this afternoon, and I saw it with my own eyes in the little silver tray we keep on the hall table. Thin paper, foreign-like, and no name on the front, only for Mr. Pritchard's consideration, writ in a neat hand. I took it up proper to the library myself, seeing as Mr. Pritchard had been in there not 10 minutes afore, and I put it on the desk right next his spectacles. And now they say there's a letter without a name found near him. But it wasn't on the desk when I went back with the vicar. It was on the carpet near the hearth, which is a funny thing." "Very funny," said Miss Marple. "And you did not, I think, pick it up?" "Lord bless you, miss, no, I wouldn't touch a thing. Only, I did notice—" "You have a very good eye," said Miss Marple. "We must take care of good eyes." She turned to the small desk and laid her fingers lightly upon the blotter. "Tell me, Mrs. Larch, the silver tray where you place the letters, who else handles it of an afternoon?" "Mostly me and Elsie. She's the parlour maid. Mr. Ewan, if he's passin'. The family's away, as you know. Lady Fortescue at her sister's in Bath. That's why the garden party was to be a subscription for the church roof and not a Fortescue affair, if you take me. Mr. Pritchard, he was helping with the subscriptions and the raffle money, because he's the solicitor." Mrs. Larch's large hands twisted upon one another for a moment. "He wasn't liked, miss. Not in the house." He spoke short to maids. "Like we was machines." "Machines break down," said Miss Marple almost to herself. "People, however, do something rather different. They remember." She looked up again with that mild, odd blue gaze which made people tell her things. "The letter. Did you notice the paper? The border? Any scent?" "Scent?" Mrs. Larch looked shocked. "Not like that, miss. Only, well, now you say so. A bit of lavender, perhaps. Or maybe that's just the manna smell." "Lavender is a very discriminating scent," said Miss Marple. "It clings to good linen and to careful people." "Thank you, Mrs. Larch. You have done the right thing in coming. And now you must go home by the path behind the hedge, so that no one says you have been discussing police business, which you have not. You have merely had a glass of barley water with an old woman who is fond of sensible housekeepers." Mrs. Larch coloured, stood and hesitated. "There's one thing more. When I took in the letter, Mr. Pritchard wasn't in the library after all, though I thought he was. I found someone there else." "Yes?" said Miss Marple, as one says to a shy child. "Mr. Mark Pritchard, the nephew. He was looking out of the window to the lawns, like he didn't want to be seen. He jumped when I came in. "For your uncle," says I, and he says, "Quick as you please. I'll see he has it," and sort of puts it down among the newspapers. Only afterwards, when they found Mr. Harold, it wasn't among newspapers at all. "Thank you, Mrs. Larch," said Miss Marple. "You will sleep tonight. It is an order." When the door had closed, Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded upon the little writing desk. The room seemed to listen with her, the small clock, the roses in their jug, the chair with its bowl of wool. In villages one does not leap to conclusions. One steps to them, as to stones in a stream. Presently she took up her pen once more and added, "Second letter, tray to desk, lavender, foreign paper, delivered by hand, seen by Mrs. Larch, placed when Mark P. present. After a minute, letter moved, desk to hearthrug." She rose then and went to the kitchen to put a kettle on the hob, because tea is a help to the intellect, and because there is little one can do in the first hours of a crime, but notice and remember. While the kettle purred, she drew the blind in the parlour to the exact degree she liked, neither fussing nor neglectful. It is in such exactitudes that a woman keeps her courage. The knock that came a little later was heavier and more official. Inspector Cross was a compact man with shoe-leather manners and a square jaw made for taking notes. He removed his hat in Miss Marple's parlour and looked faintly surprised, as men do, to find themselves at ease in a room that smells of beeswax and lavender. "Miss Marple," he said with a civil nod, "I am calling upon a number of the ladies and gentlemen who were present this afternoon, to ascertain if anything out of the way was observed. Dr. Graham tells me you have a habit of observation." "Observation," said Miss Marple placidly, "is merely a matter of being interested in people. I find people very interesting." "Quite," said the inspector, who, like many men of sound sense, distrusted being told that women were interested in people. "Well, ma'am, if you'll tell me what you saw, any odd comings and goings, I'll be obliged." Miss Marple related, with the mild clarity that belonged to her, the passing of the envelope beneath the chestnut, the hurried look of Mr. Ewan, the French door with the one bolt ill set, the crumbs and the dab of jam. "Jam?" said the inspector, writing. "What sort of jam would you say, ma'am?" "I am not a jam expert," said Miss Marple, "though I have known very wicked things done with a jar of quince preserve. This, I think, was raspberry. The seeds tell their own story." Inspector Cross, who had not expected seeds to enter the investigation so early, coughed. "And the envelope, ma'am? The one you saw past? Could you identify the men?" "Identification is such a strong word, Inspector. I could recognize them if I saw them again. One fair, one dark. The fair one had the sort of ears that suggest a childhood of being told to listen. They stick out when that is done too often." The inspector's mouth twitched. "Thank you, ma'am. Now, there is talk of a letter found near the deceased. I cannot, of course, discuss particulars." "Of course not," said Miss Marple. "But I think perhaps you will find you have 2 letters, and that only one of them will have had anything to say." She glanced up innocently. "It is wonderful how paper will travel when it is not supposed to." "2 letters," repeated the inspector, as if he were trying on a phrase before a mirror. "You think so?" "I have often known there to be 2, said Miss Marple vaguely. "There was Mrs. Price Ridley in the hymn book at St. Mary Mead, for instance, but that, of course, is quite different." "Quite," said the inspector, who would have given a small coin to know what on earth a hymn book had to do with murder. He took up his hat. "You have been most helpful, ma'am. If you would be so good as to remain at home this evening." "I do not go adventuring, Inspector," said Miss Marple with a faint smile, "but if I did, it would be only to fetch a little more wool." When he had gone, Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea and allowed herself one small, wicked thought. That Inspector Cross would very soon be told by some eager tongue that Mr. Mark Pritchard had been seen near the library at the wrong moment, and that he had a temper, and that he owed his uncle money, and that he had once, yes, once, been heard to say that it would be a good thing if the old tyrant were in his grave. Villages store such phrases as "squirrels store nuts," and bring them out at the first frost. It would do no harm, perhaps, that the inspector should hear all this. Wrong suspects are like decoy ducks. They show one where the reeds are thickest. But Miss Marple, who knew something of tempers and nephews and the ways of money, did not think Mark Pritchard had the necessary patience for what had been done, because something had been done with patience. Letters do not move themselves from desks to hearthrugs. Bolts do not half-shoot themselves and leave crescents. Jam does not strew itself on gravel in neat dabs, unless a clumsy hand, or a child, or a plan is involved. And as for ladies' handwriting on foreign paper, without a name, that, Miss Marple thought, was a feminine touch of a very particular kind, which men are quick to believe in and slow to understand. Outside the evening gathered. A blackbird fluted from the hawthorn, and the first moths came, deadly in their innocence, to the window-pane. Miss Marple sat with her cup cooling, her head a little bent, the roses breathing faintly beside her. If death had come to Rose Hill, then Rose Hill would talk, and twitch and accuse, but beneath the talk there would be a shape. She had seen shapes like it before, in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere, the tidy pattern of human folly stitched cunningly upon the plain cloth of daily life. Presently she rose, went to her bedroom, and took from the wardrobe a small shawl. She wrapped it round her shoulders, and before drawing the curtains looked out once across the green. The lamps in Mr. Cholmondeley's shop were being turned down, the Green Man's sign swung upon its iron bracket, and a young man, fair, tidy, a little too much the gentleman in a village where gentility is a matter of mind, crossed from the alley by the smithy and went quickly in the direction of the manor. Miss Marple's mouth formed, without sound, the word she wrote later on her paper. Fair man. Ears. Then she drew the curtains properly, snuffed the lamp to its correct height, and took up her knitting. When one waits for gossip to clarify into evidence, it is as well to keep the hands employed. The wool ran through her fingers in a soft chain, and the first pattern of the thing, faint, tentative, but unmistakable, took its place in her mind. In the morning, Rose Hill would wake to fear, and to talk, and to the comforting bustle of breakfast. Tonight it had only its whispers, and Miss Marple, sitting amidst the scent of roses and beeswax, heard them as clearly as if they had been spoken aloud. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. Morning in Rose Hill had a deceptive serenity. The sun shone cheerfully upon cottage gardens, hens pecked industriously at gravel paths, and from the church tower the bell for matins rang with an air of calm tradition. Yet beneath the surface every lane and parlour hummed with the same subject, the murder at the manor. In the grocer's shop Mrs. Cholmondeley confided, "Well, I always said Mr. Pritchard was a man who stirred up trouble. Sharp with his clerks, sharp with his clients. Man money, you know, money breeds enemies." At the Green Man, Mr. Barnes the innkeeper shook his head. "There's a nephew, isn't there?" "Mark. Young blood, bad temper. I heard him shouting at his uncle not a week ago about some legacy or other, and in the little tea-room Miss Hart declared firmly to her cousin, 'They'll have him in custody by tea-time, mark my words. Inspector Cross isn't one to dawdle.' By mid-morning the inspector had indeed taken decisive steps. Mark Pritchard, summoned from the manor, had been seen escorted, politely but firmly, across the green to the constable's office. His expression was one of sullen anger. His dark hair stood up in disarray, as if he had been raking his hands through it. The spectacle was enough to fix the village opinion at once. There, you see, the police know what they are about. Miss Marple, however, did not entirely share their certainty. She sat that morning with her knitting by the window, a pot of tea within reach, and her mind busy upon small matters. The silver tray of letters, the bruised lady's mantle, the jam upon the gravel, the bolt left half shut. People laughed at details, but details, she reflected, were what revealed the truth. At 11 she had a caller. It was Dr. Graham's wife, a pleasant, bustling woman with a frank face and an affection for Miss Marple. She came in, removed her gloves with energy, and seated herself without waiting to be asked. "My dear Miss Marple, you'll never believe it. They have arrested Mark. Inspector Cross told my husband only an hour ago. Of course, Harold Pritchard was a most unpleasant man, but one does not expect his own kin to finish him off." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "No, indeed. One rarely expects nephews to do so, though sometimes they do. But I should be sorry to conclude too quickly. Young men are hot-tempered, but murder requires coolness." Mrs. Graham blinked. "Do you mean to say you think Mark is innocent?" "My dear, I think nothing at all. I merely observe. Young men shout, slam doors, and say foolish things. But they do not usually leave raspberry jam in tidy little patches upon gravel." Mrs. Graham laughed aloud. "Jam? My dear Miss Marple, you are quite incorrigible." Miss Marple smiled gently and offered her more tea. Later that day, the inspector himself stopped by. He looked brisk and rather pleased with himself, as men do when they believe they have made quick work of a difficult matter. "We have Mr. Mark Pritchard in custody," he told Miss Marple, standing rather square in her parlour. "He had every motive: money owed, quarrels with the uncle, resentment over control of family funds, and according to one witness, he was seen near the library at the very time of the crime." "Ah," said Miss Marple mildly. "Near the library. And where else was he seen?" "Nowhere that matters, ma'am." "He had opportunity." "Opportunity," said Miss Marple, pouring tea for him as she might for the vicar, "is a curious word. It can be very wide or very narrow. One may have the opportunity to do something wicked, but also the opportunity to be wrongly suspected." The inspector gave a short laugh. "Forgive me, ma'am, but the evidence will speak. We found in Mr. Mark's room a handkerchief with a faint smear of ink, the same ink very likely as that on the letter without a name." "Indeed?" Miss Marple looked interested. "But men often smear ink upon handkerchiefs when they blot clumsily. Do you write letters neatly?" "Inspector?" Cross flushed faintly. "That may be. Still, the letter must have passed through his hands. He admits as much. His explanation that he was merely curious is hardly convincing." Miss Marple set down her cup. "It is a pity, Inspector, that letters cannot speak. They would tell us who touched them last, and with what purpose. But since they cannot, we must look instead at what does not fit." "And what does not fit, ma'am?" "The crumbs," said Miss Marple softly. "Crumbs that had no business outside the library window, and bolts that close too hastily, and flowers that do not crush themselves." The inspector frowned, as if reluctant to yield even a sliver of doubt. "I shall keep it in mind." "Do," said Miss Marple with gentle firmness. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Rose Hill buzzed with certainty that the case was as good as solved. Yet in her neat parlour, Miss Marple wrote another small list upon her notepaper. Mark arrested. Too obvious? Jam on gravel. Who carried food into garden? 2 letters. 1 vanished. Fair man, ears, again near manor at twilight. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely straightforward, and though Mark Pritchard might be hot-headed, he was not, to her mind, the sort of young man who arranged letters, bolts, and crumbs with deliberate patience. No. Somewhere else a cooler hand was guiding the scene, and Miss Marple, who had seen such hands before, meant to find it. Chapter 4. Old Wounds and Hidden Motives. The next day dawned clear and sharp, with the sort of September air that makes roses perk up and cobwebs glisten. Rose Hill might look peaceful, but its villagers were already restless with speculation. By breakfast, everyone knew Mark Pritchard had spent the night in custody. By elevenses, everyone knew, so they said, that evidence of a quarrel had been discovered. By luncheon, it was firmly asserted that his boots bore traces of soil from the manor garden, which of course proved everything. Miss Marple, walking to the post office that morning with her knitting bag in hand, was greeted with whispers and lifted eyebrows. She returned each salutation with gentle civility, as though discussing nothing more troubling than the weather. In truth, her mind was active upon other matters. She had lived long enough to know that whenever villagers agreed too quickly upon guilt, the truth was usually elsewhere. At the post office, Miss Hart leaned confidentially over the counter. "Inspector Cross has the letter, Miss Marple, the one without a name. They say it contains, well, a threat of sorts. Nothing signed, mind, but urging Mr. Pritchard to confess his wrongdoings, whatever those were. If you ask me, it's a lady's hand, but not local. We know our own penmanship here." Miss Marple did not contradict her. Instead, she asked, "Was Mr. Pritchard a man much liked in his profession?" "Liked?" Miss Hart gave a short laugh. "He collected rents, called in debts, and foreclosed on mortgages. I should think he was as liked as a tax collector. If he had secrets, they'd be to do with money, or perhaps ladies. He was a widower, after all." That was enough to send a little ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. Widowers could leave trails as troublesome as spinsters with too much curiosity. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple had tea with Mrs. Weatherby, who prided herself on knowing everything of consequence. Over sponge cake and a rather sharp lemon curd, she leaned forward. "Do you know, my dear, I always suspected that Mr. Pritchard had some hold over poor Mrs. Fortescue. Nothing improper, of course, not that sort of hold, but money, yes. Something to do with her late husband's estate. Lady Fortescue is quite the grand dame, but she has her weaknesses, and Harold Pritchard knew them all." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, adding a neat stitch to her knitting. "Indeed," repeated Mrs. Weatherby. "Why else would he be in charge of the subscriptions for the church roof, of all things? Mark my words, he was feathering his nest. He had that look in the evening. A quieter, more personal confidence came to Miss Marple, quite uninvited. As she passed through the lane by the smithy, she encountered young Elsie, the parlour-maid at Rose Hill Manor, who looked pale and frightened. "Oh, Miss Marple, I oughtn't speak, but I can't keep it in. Mr. Pritchard, he was always after me in ways he shouldn't have been. Not cruel, you understand, but sly. Always finding reasons to call me to the library or send me on errands when there was no need. And when I said I didn't like it, he laughed. That's the sort of man he was. Everyone thinks it's young Mr. Mark, eh? But I can tell you there were plenty with reason to wish the old one gone." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "Thank you for trusting me, my dear. Sometimes it is best to tell what troubles us. It does no harm and may even do good." Elsie looked relieved, though still frightened, and hurried away. By nightfall, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlour, with her little notepaper before her. She wrote, "Letter equals threat, unsigned hold over Lady Fortescue, estate. Elsie, unwanted attentions, debts collected, money quarrels, enemies many, not only Mark." She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Life in villages was like patchwork, each piece odd perhaps, but together forming a pattern. One had only to step back and look. Through her lace curtains she saw Inspector Cross stride past the green, purposeful as ever. He might be satisfied with his suspect. The villagers might be content with their gossip. But Miss Marple's eyes were on a different thread, the thin line of a letter, unsigned, written in a neat feminine hand, that had slipped like a shadow through Rose Hill and ended with a man dead upon a library carpet. The truth, she felt, was still waiting, quietly, like a figure behind a curtain, and Jane Marple intended to draw that curtain back. Chapter 5. A Second Shock. 2 days after the garden party, Rose Hill seemed almost itself again. The shops opened with their usual regularity, children trailed to school with satchels bumping, and the vicar rehearsed his Sunday sermon as though the world contained no murders at all. Yet beneath the surface there remained a prickling unease. Inspector Cross had declared the matter well in hand, meaning of course Mark Pritchard still in custody, and the villagers were eager to be reassured. It was therefore a cruel surprise when the second incident occurred. It happened in the late afternoon. Mrs. Larch, stout housekeeper of Rose Hill Manor, was found collapsed in the scullery. She was not dead, though at first everyone thought so, but lay white and gasping, her hand clutching at her throat. Elsie, the parlour-maid, discovered her when she came to fetch hot water, and her shriek brought half the household running. Dr. Graham was sent for at once. He arrived brisk, professional, and within 10 minutes had revived Mrs. Larch with salts and careful examination. "She has been poisoned," he announced gravely, "but lightly. Enough to incapacitate, not to kill. She is fortunate." The words ran through the manor like a chill wind. Poison! That was no accident, no fainting spell. Someone had meant to silence Mrs. Larch. Inspector Cross arrived not long after, his expression stormy. "What was she doing, Doctor?" "She had just taken a cup of tea in the scullery. Nothing unusual in that, but the dregs show a bitter residue. I should say digitalis, or something akin to it. A careful analysis will tell us more." Cross swore under his breath. First the uncle dead, now the housekeeper nearly done for. This case grows uglier by the day. Miss Marple, who had quietly appeared at the manor under the pretext of calling upon Mrs. Larch, listened with apparent mildness. She bent to adjust the coverlet around the housekeeper's shoulders, her expression one of concern. "My dear Mrs. Larch," she said gently, "you must rest now. But when you are stronger, you must tell me, was it something you meant to say?" The housekeeper's eyes fluttered open. She whispered hoarsely, "The letter. There were two. I told you." Then her strength failed, and she slipped into a troubled sleep. Miss Marple straightened slowly. She looked at Inspector Cross, who scowled as if to mask unease. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "someone else believes Mrs. Larch knows too much. And that means the truth of this matter is not yet where you have placed it." Cross bristled. "You mean Mark again." The boy's hot-headed enough, and now perhaps desperate. Miss Marple gave him a small, kind smile. "Perhaps. But desperation is usually untidy. And this was most carefully done." That evening Rosehill was alive with speculation. Poison! Who would stoop so low? The Green Man's patrons whispered darkly of foreign women with strange vials. Miss Hart at the post office declared it must be someone in the household. Who else could slip poison into a servant's tea? Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor and added another line to her notes. "Mrs. Larch poisoned. Digitalis, clearly meant to silence, not to kill. Outright confirms 2 letters. One vanished." She tapped the paper thoughtfully. A second incident had a way of unraveling the first. It was not Mark's temper she thought of now, but a cooler mind, a careful hand, one who arranged bolts, crumbs, and letters as neatly as knitting on a row, and somewhere in Rosehill that hand still moved. Chapter 6. Threads of Rivalry. The following morning Rosehill had the air of a village both scandalized and secretly delighted. 2 incidents in as many days, a murder and an attempted poisoning. The milkman was interrogated at every gate, the postmistress was nearly driven mad with questions, and even the butcher's boy carried gossip with the sausages. Inspector Cross, grim and harried, went about declaring that progress was being made. The villagers interpreted this as meaning Mark Pritchard's guilt was assured. But Miss Marple, who knew the ways of villages and of men, did not mistake bluster for certainty. She began, as was her habit, not by asking questions directly, but by listening. A widow knitting in the corner of the tea-room was far less alarming than a constable with a notebook. People, Miss Marple had long discovered, will say things to an old lady that they would never confide to an official. At the tea-room that day, she learned several small but telling facts. From Mrs. Weatherby, with relish, Mr. Pritchard had a quarrel with Dr. Graham not 6 months ago. Something about a bill unpaid. Doctors don't take kindly to being treated like tradesmen. From Miss Hart, leaning across the counter, Lady Fortescue depended heavily on him for advice. Too heavily, if you ask me. He knew her affairs better than her own solicitor in Bath, and she didn't always agree with his advice either. From young Mrs. Barnes at the Green Man, Elsie told me her mistress once said she wished Mr. Pritchard would leave the manor altogether, but she couldn't, of course, not while he had his claws in the accounts. Later, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane to the church. She paused at the lich gate to admire the roses, and found herself joined by Dr. Graham. "A nasty business, Miss Marple," he said at once. 2 lives nearly lost. 1 gone. My wife says the village will never be the same. Miss Marple looked at him with mild eyes. You had a disagreement with Mr. Pritchard once, I hear. The doctor flushed. Oh, that. A trifling matter. He disliked paying his accounts promptly. I pressed him for a settlement, and he threatened to withdraw his custom. I told him plainly he was welcome to do so. He relented. No more than professional ill-feeling. Professional ill-feeling, murmured Miss Marple, sometimes leads to worse. But of course you are not the sort to let such trifles linger. The doctor smiled ruefully. You put me in my place, Miss Marple. No, indeed. Harold Pritchard was an irritant, but not worth murder. At the Manor that afternoon, Miss Marple found Elsie pale and jumpy. She coaxed the girl gently, with a tact that seemed no more than grandmotherly kindness. He was pressing you, was he not? She asked softly. Elsie coloured and nodded. He would corner me in passages, miss, and say things I didn't like. But if I told Mrs. Larch, she'd only say, Keep quiet, it's not our place. It wasn't right. No, said Miss Marple gently. It was not right. Men like Mr. Pritchard often make enemies without realizing it. They think they are clever, but they are careless. Elsie looked at her wide-eyed. Do you think it was Miss Irene? Irene? Miss Marple asked, as if the name were unfamiliar. Mr. Pritchard's clerk's sister, Elsie whispered. She came to the house sometimes, and he was, well, very attentive. Some said too attentive. But then she stopped coming, all very sudden-like. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire and examined the threads. She wrote them down, as always, on her notepaper. Dr. Graham quarrel, money. Lady Fortescue equals dependent, perhaps blackmailed Elsie, harassed Irene, clerk's sister, sudden absence nephew too obvious. Decoy? She paused, then added, Poison requires access plus knowledge. Household, doctor, careful hand. Her needles clicked in steady rhythm. Villages, she thought, were like gardens, full of pretty flowers, but also nettles, thorns and roots that entwined beneath the soil. Tug one, and the whole bed shifted. Somewhere in Rosehill, beneath its lace-curtained windows and polished tea-sets, ran such a route, dark, tangled, and dangerous, and Jane Marple, who had spent a lifetime pulling weeds from neat borders, meant to find it. Chapter 7. Suspicion shifts. The arrest of young Mark Pritchard had pleased the villagers at first. It made everything tidy. A quarrelsome nephew, money owed, a hot temper. What could be simpler? But after Mrs. Larch's poisoning, the neatness began to fray. Even the most eager gossips sensed that matters were not so simple, and when Inspector Cross released Mark on bail, pending further inquiry, as he announced with a scowl, the whispers started afresh. If not Mark, then who? By afternoon, much of Rosehill had settled on a new name. Lady Fortescue. She had the most to lose, Mrs. Weatherby declared over her knitting at the tea-room. Mr. Pritchard knew every penny of her accounts. If he had pressed her, if she feared exposure, well, a desperate woman may do desperate things. Miss Hart, the postmistress, was firmer still. Mark my words, it was Lady Fortescue. She's got that cold look, as if she's used to hiding things. And they say she's been taking out loans. Why, I've seen the bank envelopes myself. Lady Fortescue returned from Bath the following morning, sweeping into the Manor in black silk, her head high, her expression composed. The villagers watched from behind curtains, whispering of disgrace. Inspector Cross wasted no time. He appeared at the Manor that afternoon, all brisk efficiency, and was shown into the drawing-room. Miss Marple, who had called with roses for the poor housekeeper's recovery, was permitted to sit discreetly with her knitting in the corner. The inspector wasted little courtesy. My lady, I must ask directly, were you aware of any financial irregularities involving Mr. Pritchard? Lady Fortescue drew herself up. Irregularities? Certainly not. Mr. Pritchard managed certain matters for me, but his methods were entirely his own. If he misused my confidence, I cannot answer for it. Cross pressed. He was in possession of documents concerning your late husband's estate. Did he threaten to expose you to scandal? Lady Fortescue's cheeks coloured faintly. This is intolerable. Harold Pritchard may have been officious, but scandal? Certainly not. If you imagine I had anything to do with his dreadful death, you are mistaken. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She noticed what others might not. The way Lady Fortescue's hand trembled upon the arm of the sofa, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her gloves, the flicker of her eyes when the inspector mentioned documents. Lavender, like the faint trace on the anonymous letter. But Miss Marple said nothing. That evening the village had fresh fuel. Lady Fortescue under suspicion. It was better than any play. Yet even as tongues wagged, Miss Marple's thoughts turned elsewhere. She recalled Elsie's frightened confession, the sudden disappearance of Irene, the clerk's sister, and the careful hand that had placed poison in Mrs. Larch's tea. These were not the acts of a panicked aristocrat, nor of a hot-headed nephew. No, they bore the mark of someone else. The next morning brought another ripple. Dr. Graham, summoned again to examine Mrs. Larch, found a folded note slipped under his surgery door. It read, in the same neat feminine hand as the anonymous letter, "Silence is safest. Some things are better buried." He showed it at once to Inspector Cross, who scowled, muttered about female hysterics, and tucked it grimly into his case. Miss Marple, when told of it by Mrs. Graham in strictest confidence, felt her lips purse ever so slightly. 2 letters, and now a third, all written in the same careful hand, all unsigned. It was not panic that wrote such notes. It was control. That evening Miss Marple added to her list, "Lady Fortescue. Lavender gloves possible. Financial threat. Anonymous note to Dr. Graham, same hand. Pattern, feminine hand, careful placement, deliberate timing, not panic, calculation." She laid down her pen. "So much," she murmured to herself, "depends on who benefits when gossip spreads. For gossip is like quicklime. It burns what it touches." And in Rosehill, someone was scattering it with great care. Chapter 8. The Clue in the Ledger. The morning after Lady Fortescue's return, Inspector Cross paid another visit to Rosehill Manor. His tread upon the gravel was as determined as ever, and his jaw had that set look which proclaimed to the world that he was close, very close, to what he called the heart of the matter. Miss Marple, on her way to deliver a basket of scones to Mrs. Larch, happened to arrive just as the inspector was leaving. His expression was one of satisfaction, tinged with frustration. "Well, ma'am," he said, lifting his hat, "we are nearer. I have just had sight of Mr. Pritchard's ledgers. There are irregularities, funds missing from Lady Fortescue's accounts. If ever a motive was clear, there it is." Miss Marple inclined her head, her blue eyes smiled. "Funds may be missing, Inspector. But tell me, does the ledger say who benefited?" Cross frowned. Benefited. Pritchard managed the money. He had the opportunity to misappropriate it. "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "But I think you will find that he did not line his own pockets. No, he was too clever for that. He arranged matters so another might gain. That way, when suspicion fell, it would not fall upon him." The inspector looked skeptical. "You have an odd way of looking at things, Miss Marple." "Human nature, Inspector," she said gently, "is very odd indeed." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple was invited, quite without formality, ushered to the library by Lady Fortescue, who had begun to realize that the quiet old lady from the village carried more weight than her lace collars suggested. "Miss Marple, you must believe me," Lady Fortescue said, her voice taut. "If my accounts show irregularities, I am the victim, not the culprit. Harold Pritchard warned me that certain investments had failed, but now I see he was shifting moneys between ledgers. To what end, I cannot tell." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking. "Did you sign many papers, Lady Fortescue?" "More than I should," he insisted. "I dislike such things, and he pressed me to trust him." Miss Marple looked kindly. "And did you ever notice who else had access to these papers?" Lady Fortescue hesitated. "His clerk, Mr. Jameson, of course, a dreary man but reliable, and sometimes, though rarely, his sister Irene delivered envelopes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Irene? Yes, I think she delivered something indeed. That evening Miss Marple took a walk past the churchyard. She paused near the chestnut tree where, on the day of Vili, the fête, she had observed the furtive passing of an envelope between two men. She stooped to pluck a fallen leaf, but her eyes were fixed elsewhere, on the faint scuff of a heel in the gravel preserved by dry weather, leading from the chestnut towards the manor. Fair man, ears, she wrote later on her paper. Connection with Clark, or Irene. Meanwhile, the inspector busied himself with Lady Fortescue, demanding explanations and producing documents. But Miss Marple, in her parlour, was quietly setting another kind of net. She made a list, neat and precise. Anonymous letters, feminine hand, onion skin paper, seen at manor, tray, vanished, reappeared on hearthrug. Mrs. Larch poisoned after speaking of letters, Clark's sister Irene. Sudden absence, envelope exchange beneath chestnut, fair man plus dark man. Beneath this she wrote in her fine script, "The letters are the key. They are not threats. They are lures." She laid down her pen with a faint smile. Villagers liked to imagine that crime was about fury, or jealousy, or quick passions. But she had seen time and again that the cleverest crimes were about patience. Someone in Rosehill had been moving pieces slowly, as in a game of draughts, and now Miss Marple thought it was time to see who would move next. She closed her notebook, folded her knitting, and murmured softly to herself, "Tomorrow, I think, I shall make a little visit, and ask a very small question about onion skin paper." Chapter 9. The Vanished Sister. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to hurry, yet there was a firmness in her step the next morning as she walked towards Marleycombe, the nearest market town. She had learned long ago that answers sometimes lay not in the heart of a village, but just beyond its borders, where gossip faded into other lives. Her destination was a modest lodging-house on the High Street. She had heard of it from Mrs. Graham, who remembered Irene Jameson staying there some weeks before. Miss Marple arrived with a small parcel of knitted socks for the landlady's grandchildren, an offering that smoothed the way for conversation. The landlady, a cheerful woman with shrewd eyes, was more than willing to talk. Oh yes, Miss Jameson lodged here. Quiet girl, neat in her ways. Always writing letters she was, on that thin paper of hers. Foreign, she said. Cheaper in bulk. But she left sudden 3 weeks ago. Said she'd had an opportunity in London. Paid her bill, no fuss, though she looked pale. I thought she'd had a quarrel. Miss Marple's eyes softened. A quarrel with her brother, perhaps? The landlady pursed her lips. Might be. Mr. Jameson came once, very stern. They argued in the hall, I heard it. He said she was interfering. She cried a little, poor thing, but she had spirit too. Told him she'd write what she liked, and that wrongs must be righted. Letters, murmured Miss Marple. Yes, I dare say she wrote more than one. Miss Marple took her leave, her mind ticking quietly. Irene, with her onion skin paper, her feminine hand, and her determination to right wrongs. That perhaps was the origin of the unsigned letters. But Irene had vanished before the fate, and yet someone had continued to deliver them. On her return to Rosehill, Miss Marple stopped by the manor under the pretext of visiting Mrs. Larch. The housekeeper was stronger now, though still pale, and spoke with effort. "Miss Marple, I remember now. That letter tray, the one I told you of. There were 2 envelopes that day, not one. I fetched one to the library, but when I came back, the tray was empty. I asked Elsie, and she swore she hadn't touched it. So where did the other go?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "That, my dear, is just the question." That evening, as she sat with her knitting, Miss Marple added to her notes. Irene wrote letters. Onion skin. Determined to expose wrongs. Quarrel with brother Jameson. Clark. Vanished. London. Or silenced. 2 letters in tray. Only one accounted for. She tapped the pen against her chin. If Irene had indeed written those letters, then someone else had taken them up after she was gone. Someone who found them useful. for bait. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mark Pritchard, looking harried and dishevelled, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Miss Marple," he burst out, "you must believe me. I had nothing to do with my uncle's death, but the inspector. He's still watching me, waiting to pounce again. If I could only prove where I was when—" Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "My dear boy, innocence is rarely proved by protest. It is proved by patience. Tell me instead, did you ever see your uncle with Miss Jameson, the sister of his clerk?" Mark looked startled. "Irene?" "Yes, once or twice. He was very gallant with her, in his way. I think he made her promises. She vanished rather suddenly. My uncle laughed about it, said women were sentimental creatures who always imagined themselves wronged. But I thought—" He broke off, frowning. "I thought she looked frightened." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him kindly. "You have helped me very much, Mr. Mark. More than you know." When he had gone, she wrote the last line upon her paper. "Irene frightened. Silenced? Who benefits from her absence?" She folded the page neatly. The shape of the pattern was emerging, though not yet complete. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was like embroidery. One began with a tangle, and only when the threads were pulled back did the picture reveal itself. And she was beginning to see, faintly, the outline of a very careful hand. Chapter 10. The letter resurfaces. The village of Rosehill was not in the habit of keeping secrets. Even the smallest matter, a borrowed teacup, a gardener's wage, the failure of a clutch of eggs, was known within hours. Yet some things, Miss Marple reflected, could remain hidden if they were hidden with care. And so it was a true surprise when, one blustery morning, the verger of St. Michael's Church appeared at the vicarage with an object in his hand. A crumpled envelope, unstamped, thin as onion skin, discovered tucked beneath a hymn book in the pew near the pulpit. It bore no address, only a few words on the front written in the neat feminine hand. "For Mr. Pritchard's eyes only." The discovery caused a flurry. Inspector Cross, summoned at once, examined it with stern satisfaction. "There we are, Miss Marple. Another of those confounded letters. This one proves what I have said all along. Lady Fortescue, or her friends, attempting blackmail. Threatening Pritchard in his own parish church, no less." Miss Marple, who had been invited to the vicarage for tea and scones, looked at the envelope with quiet interest. "It is curious, is it not, Inspector, that this letter was not in the manor at all but here, in church? How do you suppose it travelled from one to the other?" Cross frowned. "Pritchard may have brought it himself." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly. "But the paper is too crisp, too little handled." "I should say it had been placed here recently, not weeks ago, and by someone who hoped it would be found." The inspector muttered something about old women's fancies, but Miss Marple only smiled. That evening Miss Marple was visited unexpectedly by Lady Fortescue. The lady looked pale and strained, her gloved hands restless in her lap. "Miss Marple, I cannot endure it. Everyone looks at me as though I were a murderess. Tell me, do you believe me guilty?" Miss Marple's blue eyes rested gently upon her. "No, my dear. You are too proud to poison tea in a scullery, and too careless to scatter jam upon gravel. But you are not too proud, perhaps, to allow another to use your name." Lady Fortescue gasped. "Another? Who?" "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is what we must discover. Tell me, did you ever employ onion-skin paper?" "Certainly not. I detest flimsy stationery. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because someone who disliked you very much has taken care to use it." The next morning Miss Marple paid a call upon Mr. Jameson, Pritchard's clerk. He was a tall, spare man with thinning hair, who greeted her with an air of weary courtesy. "You will forgive me, Mr. Jameson," she said, "for troubling you at your office. But I am fond of accuracy, and I wondered, did your sister Irene leave many belongings behind?" His face tightened. "My sister is not the concern of this inquiry, madam. She has gone to London. That is all." Indeed, murmured Miss Marple, her eyes mild. And yet I heard she wrote a great many letters. Letters that seemed to disturb your employer. Letters which perhaps you would rather had not been written. Jameson's lips pressed thin. Idle gossip. Irene was foolish, sentimental. She imagined herself in love, and when she was disappointed she wrote nonsense. It meant nothing. Miss Marple inclined her head. Perhaps. And yet nonsense, I have often found, is very dangerous, when it is true. She left him then, but not before she noticed the inkwell upon his desk. It bore faint smears, and beside it lay a blotter marked with the ghost of neat feminine writing. Not Irene's hand, surely. But then, whose? That evening Miss Marple wrote upon her paper, "Letter in church equals planted. Recent meant to incriminate Lady Fortescue Jameson. Evasive Irene blotter shows feminine hand." But not Irene. Someone continuing Irene's letters after she vanished. She tapped the pen against her chin. So, the ghost of Irene continues to write, and someone profits by it. Then she added one more line in firmer ink. The letters are not warnings. They are weapons. And Miss Marple, who knew the quiet cruelty of human nature, felt certain that whoever had picked up Irene's pen had also picked up her fate. Chapter 11. A near-fatal mistake. Rose Hill was restless. With each new twist, Mark accused, Lady Fortescue questioned. The poisoned tea, the letter in church. The villagers grew more feverish in their speculation. By now every respectable person had been suspected at least once, and yet no one felt safer. The inspector, for his part, stalked about with a look of grim determination. "The net is closing," he told anyone who asked. But Miss Marple, seated by her parlour window with her knitting, reflected that the net was closing around the wrong fish. It was the evening of the harvest supper at the church hall, a cheerful bustling affair, with trestle tables laden with pies and trifles, lanterns strung across the beams, and children darting between legs. Miss Marple attended, of course, with a basket of her own sponge cake. She liked to observe such gatherings. In the jostle and laughter, people often betrayed what they tried to hide. She noticed at once the fair man with the prominent ears, the one she had seen exchanging an envelope at the fete. He was not local, though he attempted to blend in with the crowd. He kept close to Mr. Jameson, the clerk, speaking little, but his eyes were restless. Miss Marple filed this quietly away. The evening passed merrily enough until just as the raffle was being drawn, a commotion broke out near the tea-table. Mrs. Weatherby, no less, was choking and gasping, her hands clawing at her throat. Cries rang out. "She's poisoned! Fetch the doctor!" Dr. Graham hurried to her side, loosening her collar, examining her pulse. "Not poison," he announced after a tense minute. "A severe reaction. Something she ate. Walnuts, most likely. She is allergic. She will recover." Relief swept the hall, but in the midst of the fuss, Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught something else. A cup of tea, abandoned upon the table, still steamed faintly. The rim bore a smear of powder, not sugar nor cream, and near it a teaspoon lay with a residue that glittered oddly under the lantern light. Miss Marple bent to adjust her shawl, and quite by accident slipped the spoon into her reticule. Later that night, in the quiet of her parlour, she examined it by lamplight. Yes, the faint bitter tang was there. Poison. Someone had meant that tea for another, and Mrs. Weatherby had only taken it by chance. A near-fatal mistake. She took up her notepaper and wrote, "Attempt at harvest supper. Teacup. Poison. Target not Mrs. Weatherby, wrong victim. Fair man present. Near Jameson poison again equals same careful hand." She sat back, her knitting untouched. The pattern was almost complete. Someone had silenced Harold Pritchard with calculation, had sought to silence Mrs. Larch, had planted letters to incriminate Lady Fortescue, and now had nearly claimed another victim by accident. Such care, such patience, but even the most careful hand may slip. Miss Marple allowed herself one small sigh. "It will not be long now," she murmured. "Not long at all." Chapter 12. Miss Marple Lays a Snare. The morning after the harvest supper, Rose Hill awoke with a mixture of relief and unease. Mrs. Weatherby, recovered and more than a little triumphant at the attention her near demise had occasioned, declared loudly that she had been the victim of a murderous design. "I dare say someone put it in my tea on purpose," she told the postmistress. "It's always the outspoken ones who are targeted." Miss Hart merely pursed her lips. "If it was intended for you, Mrs. Weatherby, then I'd say the village has a most discriminating poisoner." The remark was repeated half a dozen times by luncheon, and by then nearly everyone believed that Mrs. Weatherby had been marked for death. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She had the poisoned spoon in her possession, carefully wrapped in brown paper, and she had seen the look upon the face of the fair stranger with the prominent ears when Mrs. Weatherby collapsed. A look not of triumph, but of alarm. He had not meant her. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call upon Inspector Cross at his temporary office in the constable's lodge. He looked weary and irritable, his desk littered with papers. "I suppose you've come to tell me some old wives' tale," he muttered. "I came," said Miss Marple placidly, "to ask whether you have considered the possibility that the murderer wishes us to think of Lady Fortescue and young Mr. Mark, while all the time the truth lies elsewhere." Cross scowled. "And where would you have me look, ma'am?" "At those who write letters without names," said Miss Marple gently. She set the brown parcel upon his desk. "You will find that spoon most interesting. It is the second attempt at poison, Inspector, but the hand that wields poison is seldom careless forever. This one is ready to betray itself." Cross unwrapped the parcel, frowned, and muttered something about chemical tests. Miss Marple merely smiled and rose to go. Her next visit was to the manor, where she found Elsie dusting in the library. "You look troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. Elsie lowered her duster. "It's Mr. Jameson, miss. He's been in and out of this room at all hours, always with papers. And last night I saw him by the fire, burning something. He said it was waste. But I swear I smelled lavender on the smoke." "Lavender," murmured Miss Marple. "Yes, that is very useful indeed." That evening Miss Marple wrote on her notepaper, "Second poisoning attempt. Spoon Jameson burning papers. Lavender scent. Letters. Acid Irene's hand continued after her absence. Fair man present, accomplice, perhaps courier. Then below in firmer hand. Plan. Gather suspects at manor. Create occasion for letter to appear. Observe who cannot resist moving it." Miss Marple folded the paper and tucked it neatly away. Her eyes shone with quiet purpose. She had always said that truth must be allowed to show itself. One could not drag it into daylight, but one could arrange a little sunlight and watch who blinked. The trap, she thought, was nearly ready. Chapter 13. The Gathering at the Manor. It was Lady Fortescue herself who issued the invitations, though the idea had been Miss Marple's, a small and informal tea at Rose Hill Manor, to thank those who had been so kind during the recent disturbances. That was how it was described, but in truth it was a stage, and Miss Marple meant to see who performed upon it. The drawing-room had been arranged with elegance, lace cloths, polished silver, a great bowl of late roses. Mrs. Larch, pale but determined, presided over the tea service with Elsie in attendance. Dr. and Mrs. Graham were present, as was Inspector Cross, stiff and watchful. Mr. Jameson, the clerk, arrived punctually, his manner dry and cautious. The fair stranger with the prominent ears appeared also, introduced vaguely as a business acquaintance. Mark Pritchard stood at the window, restless, his hands thrust in his pockets. And in a corner, quietly knitting, sat Miss Jane Marple, her blue eyes mild, her attention seemingly upon her wool. The tea began in proper fashion. Scones, seed cake, cucumber sandwiches, conversation strained but polite, It was only when Elsie, a little flustered, placed upon the side table a small silver tray with an envelope upon it. "Delivered by hand just now, ma'am," she announced, that the air sharpened. The envelope was thin, onion skin, unstamped. Upon its front, in that neat feminine hand, "For immediate attention." Lady Fortescue gasped. Inspector Cross leaned forward at once, his hand half extended. But Miss Marple's eyes were not upon the envelope. They were upon the faces. Mr. Jameson's lips pressed tight, colour rising in his cheeks. Mark Pritchard frowned in bewilderment. Dr. Graham's brows lifted, but it was the fair stranger who betrayed himself. For as the envelope was set down, his eyes darted towards it with quick, hungry recognition, and his hand twitched ever so slightly before he mastered it. Miss Marple clicked her needles together and spoke, her voice mild but clear. "How curious. A letter arriving at just such a moment. Perhaps, Inspector, it would be well if no one touched it. Not until we are all agreed." Cross, irritated, muttered, "A harmless precaution." He gestured for the letter to remain upon the tray. But Miss Marple had seen enough. That tiny twitch, that flicker of relief, the sort of thing only an old lady, well versed in human frailty, would notice. When the tea was concluded and the guests dispersed, Inspector Cross drew Miss Marple aside. "You mean to tell me, ma'am, that you can solve this business with nothing more than a look at a fellow's face?" "Not a look, Inspector," she said gently. "A habit. People reveal themselves when they think no one sees. Letters without names are like mirrors. They show us not what is written, but who fears to be reflected." Cross frowned. "You believe this fellow, the stranger, is our man?" Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly. "Not the man alone. A man does not write in a neat feminine hand, but men may borrow such hands, and silence them when it suits. Think of Irene Jameson. Think of what her brother may have gained by guiding her pen, and then think who carried those letters, who placed them where they must be found. A courier, Inspector, one who twitches when the paper appears, because he knows it should not be there at all." Cross's eyes narrowed. "You mean Jameson? And this stranger?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, but it will be better if they betray themselves more plainly. A little more patience, Inspector. The trap is not quite sprung." That night in her cottage, Miss Marple added the final note to her paper. "Letter at tea equals bait. Stranger's reaction. Arrow guilty knowledge. Jameson nervous burning papers. Together equals design. Irene's pen, their plot, and beneath it, tomorrow, reveal." She set down her pen, folded her hands, and allowed herself a small smile. The curtain was nearly ready to rise. Chapter 14. The Final Trap. The following evening the vicar announced a special vestry meeting at the church. It was in outward form about the repairs to the roof and the allocation of the fete proceeds. Inwardly, however, it was something more. At Miss Marple's discreet suggestion, Inspector Cross had agreed that the gathering of villagers would provide the perfect stage for observation. The nave was lit by lamps, the pews filled with the respectable and the curious alike. Lady Fortescue sat stiffly in black, Mrs. Weatherby rustled in her shawls, and even Mrs. Larch, still wan from her ordeal, insisted on attending. Dr. Graham and his wife were present, as was Mark Pritchard, pale but defiant. Near the front, Mr. Jameson sat with his thin lips pressed tight, and beside him the fair stranger with the ears, introduced now somewhat vaguely as Mr. Latham, an associate. At the back, in her usual quiet way, Miss Marple knitted steadily, her ball of wool resting in her lap. The meeting proceeded in ordinary fashion until Inspector Cross rose and cleared his throat. His voice was firm, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, there have been many rumors regarding the death of Mr. Harold Pritchard and the subsequent attempts at mischief in this parish. I will say openly that I am now in possession of fresh evidence. A letter, unsigned in a feminine hand, has come into my keeping, And tonight, for reasons of transparency, I shall place it upon the vestry table. A murmur swept the pews. Cross set down an envelope. The same thin onion skin paper, the same neat script. He did not open it. "Whoever wrote these letters," he continued, "sought to frighten or blackmail. Whoever delivered them sought to incriminate others, and I believe those responsible are in this room tonight." There was a sharp intake of breath from Lady Fortescue. Mr. Jameson shifted in his seat. Mr. Latham's eyes darted towards the letter. Miss Marple's needles clicked on serenely. The silence stretched. Then came the moment she had known would arrive. Mr. Latham, unable to bear it, leaned forward, his hand twitching towards the table. "Surely, Inspector, you should examine it at once," he blurted, "for everyone's peace of mind." All eyes turned. It was too quick, too eager. Inspector Cross narrowed his gaze, and in that pause Miss Marple's soft voice carried across the room. "Strange, is it not, that Mr. Latham knows precisely what sort of letter it is, when it has not yet been shown? He recognizes the handwriting, perhaps, a handwriting he has seen before, when he carried Irene Jameson's notes from her lodging to her brother. Poor Irene, who vanished so suddenly. It was her hand upon those papers, until someone else took up her pen." Gasps broke out. Jameson half rose, his face ashen. "This is outrageous." "My sister went to London." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "Your sister never reached London. She wrote letters, yes, earnest, foolish, dangerous letters. But she disappeared just when Mr. Pritchard began to fear exposure, and then most conveniently her hand continued to write, though she was gone. You, Mr. Jameson, supplied the words, and Mr. Latham delivered them, planted them, moved them where they would do most harm." The vicar's wife cried out. Lady Fortescue dropped her handkerchief. Inspector Cross barked, "Sit down, both of you." But Miss Marple's voice, mild as ever, did not waver. Harold Pritchard's death silenced his knowledge. Mrs. Larch was nearly silenced when she saw too much. And last night another cup of tea nearly silenced the wrong person altogether. But poisoners are careless at heart. They cannot resist meddling. All eyes were fixed upon Jameson and Latham. Jameson's lips moved soundlessly. Latham's face twitched with fury. It was Inspector Cross who stepped forward and laid his hand firmly upon the clerk's shoulder. "I think, gentlemen," he said grimly, "you've had your last word." In the pew at the back, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together one final time. The trap had sprung, gently, politely, but without fail. Chapter 15. The Explanation. The vestry was hushed. Inspector Cross, square and triumphant, had his men at either side of Jameson and Latham, yet there was still a restless murmuring among the villagers. Questions, doubts, the insatiable hunger to know. It was Miss Marple who supplied it in her gentle way. She set aside her knitting and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "You must forgive me," she began, "but I am fond of order. It troubles me when things do not fit. And from the first, there were details that did not fit at all." The assembly leaned forward. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but perfectly clear. "Mr. Harold Pritchard was not popular. He had money matters in his keeping, and he was careless with people's feelings. Such men make enemies easily, but his death in the library was no crime of sudden temper. No, it was arranged with patience. Consider the crumbs of cake and the smear of jam upon the gravel outside the French window. Someone had slipped out with a plate in hand, an untidy, hurried business. Inside, the bolts were mismatched, one thrust forward too fast. That told me of a man unfamiliar with domestic details, anxious to secure a door without knowing quite how. Then there was Mrs. Larch's account. She saw not one but 2 letters upon the tray that afternoon. Only one reached the library. What became of the other? That, I think, was the first Irene Jameson wrote, the one that spoke too plainly of wrongs she wished to expose. Gasps echoed. Jameson flinched. Miss Marple's eyes were mild, but her tone sharpened slightly. Poor Irene. She had courage, but she lacked caution. She believed her letters might force Mr. Pritchard to confess some misdeed. Instead, they sealed her fate. She disappeared. and thereafter her hand continued to write, too neat, too convenient, a hand imitated by her brother, the clerk, who had access to her samples, her paper, her ink, and who better than he to know where such letters might wound. Lady Fortescue gave a stifled cry. "The lavender scent," Miss Marple went on serenely, "was the last trace of her. Lavender clung to her linen. When Jameson burned papers in the grate, Elsie smelt it. He was destroying what remained of his sister's hand. Now, a forger requires a messenger. That was Mr. Latham. I saw him at the fete, slipping an envelope to Jameson, and again at the harvest supper, his eyes darting towards the teacup that was not meant for Mrs. Weatherby at all. He was careless then. Poisoners always are in the end. The letters, the poison, the missing girl, they all pointed the same way. Harold Pritchard had discovered Jameson's manipulations. Jameson feared exposure, feared the ruin of his scheme, and so he struck first. With his accomplice's help, he arranged the scene, moved letters to incriminate others, and silence those who might tell. Inspector Cross gave a grunt of satisfaction. "Neatly put, ma'am. Neatly put indeed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Human nature, Inspector, is much the same in Rose Hill as in St. Mary Mead. The guilty cannot resist tidying their own mess, and it is in that tidying that they betray themselves." There was a long silence. Then, as though released, the villagers began to murmur again. Astonishment, indignation, pity. Lady Fortescue fanned herself violently. Mrs. Weatherby declared she had always suspected as much. Elsie wept quietly into her apron. Through it all, Miss Marple sat placidly, her knitting once more in her hands. The pattern was complete. Chapter 16. Aftermath. In the days that followed, Rose Hill returned, outwardly, to its old rhythm. The milkman's cart rattled along the lanes, hens scratched contentedly in cottage gardens, and the church bell tolled as faithfully as ever. Yet a hush lingered, like the fading echo of thunder after a storm. Mr. Jameson and Mr. Latham were taken away under police escort. There was much to do in Marleycombe over the formal charges: forgery, fraud, conspiracy, and murder. It was whispered that Irene's fate had been discovered at last. A shallow grave beyond the quarry, where wildflowers now grew. The village shuddered, but spoke of it in lowered voices, as if to soften the blow with discretion. Lady Fortescue, once so stately, walked now with her head high but her eyes shadowed. She declared her accounts would henceforth be managed only by her solicitor in Bath, and she donated a generous sum to the church roof in Harold Pritchard's memory. This, of course, caused whispers enough on its own. Mrs. Larch, recovering her strength, declared herself determined to remain at the manor. "It takes more than poison to put me down," she announced stoutly, though she crossed herself whenever she passed the library door. Mark Pritchard, his name cleared, spoke earnestly of leaving Rose Hill to seek work in London. The villagers agreed that was sensible. A young man with such a cloud over him would do well to begin afresh. And Miss Marple, she tended her roses, mended her lace curtains, and resumed her knitting in her sunny parlour. She was much in demand, of course, asked a dozen times to retell how she had seen what no one else had. But she always demurred, saying only that she had been fortunate in noticing a few little things. One afternoon Mrs. Graham stopped by with a jar of quince preserve and asked, half in jest, "My dear Miss Marple, however do you bear it? To live always among such dreadful goings-on?" Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling. "Why, my dear, I find villages the most instructive places in the world. All human nature is here if one only watches. And when one has seen it often enough, well, nothing ever seems quite extraordinary." She set her knitting down and poured the tea. Outside, a blackbird sang from the hedge, and the sun gilded the quiet roofs of Rose Hill. The murder, the letters, the poison, they would fade in time into village memory, half-whispered over teacups, embroidered with each telling. Life would go on, fetes and church bazaars, gossip and gardens, the small dramas of daily life. And Miss Jane Marple, serene in her cottage, would go on too, listening, observing and waiting, for she knew as surely as roses bloom in summer that where human nature exists, mischief is never far behind.